hoping to go back to your film that was about military personnel returning to civilian life. And so that was based on a family member or
It
loosely
was.
based?
Yeah, loosely based. My cousin Ben, he was a Marine in Iraq and did multiple tours. And, he and I growing up, we were close cousins. We lived in different states. At the time I was in Montana, he was in Oregon and Washington. But we'd always meet up at grandparents' place and play military, and I'd be the commander, he'd be my little soldier, and then, flash forward 15 years later and he's in the Marines and I'm an artist. But he was in an IED attack over there. His leg was hit with shrapnel, and then through an ambush, a bullet also hit him, and obviously hospitalized for a long time. And when he came out, I was visiting home and saw him over the holidays, and we were talking about it, and he just said something that was mind-blowing to me. He said, he was fortunate because he had a family that he could go and stay with, but dealing with a lot of the bureaucracy around the support for the veterans, he was saying that a lot of the guys he knew in the hospital went straight from the hospital to the streets if they didn't have a place to go, because their disability pay would take so long to be able to come in. And that just boggled my mind. And so I spent about 2 years on and off in my free time just getting to know a lot of homeless vets, a lot of them in New York. Went down to DC and met a couple, and just wherever I would go, I would try to find someone to speak to and just hear their stories. And some of them I spent a couple days with, walking in the distance, just kind of observing, seeing how people portrayed them, how they handled social situations. One of them was sleeping in a car out in the woods. Another one I spent a night under a bridge with, just trying to, as much as I could, understand that and then bring it to life in a way that I was hoping for other people like me who were naive about the reality that our combat vets face coming back home. I was hoping it'd be an eye-opener to kind of walk in their shoes for an hour and a half and get a sort of unflinching look at the struggles, emotional, physical, systemic, and social that they deal with. And I was pleasantly surprised when it all came out that veterans themselves, who I didn't think would be as into it because they've already lived it, but how it really became an important film for a lot of actual combat vets who felt like watching that, they're like, well, if some filmmaker told the story, it must not just be me. So it helped some of them realize that they're not alone in that struggle, that there's others out there that are dealing with those same issues. They have such a self-reliance that's bred into them through their military training, through, their they're forces of nature when they're in combat, and they come back and they're dealing with these issues, and it's almost an embarrassment to admit that they're dealing with depression, that they're dealing with social isolation, financial issues, all that sort of stuff. And so to showcase it in that way where they can see that this is a systemic issue, it's not a personal flaw of theirs, that it's something that's happening to a lot of people. It was great to see that response to it as well. Obviously, it was something that was personally really important to me. And it was also, in my own way, something that's politically, I try not to be too heavy-handed in my films, but I was very much an anti-war advocate back in the early days, and still am, but the early days of those wars. And to me, it was a way to make an anti-war film that would speak to pro-war people and let them see, it's not about whether the war was right or wrong, it's about the aftermath of it. And so if you're going to start a war, think about the consequences of it, what you're going to be doing to those men and women we send over there. And so it was great to see the conversations that it started. For such a small film, it really, I was proud of the impact it had.
Right. Did you watch a lot of films like Coming Home and things like that from the Vietnam era?
This is almost embarrassing. I didn't even know about the film Coming Home until one of the reviews of Fray actually compared it to Coming Home. I was like, oh. I hadn't seen Rambo, the first one at the time. I'd seen some of the later ones. I hadn't seen the first one at the time. I hadn't seen Born on the 4th of July, but I had seen Hurt Locker, I'd seen Apocalypse Now, Platoon. So I'd seen a lot of the actual war movies, and some of them that touch on those aspects of the coming home experience. But one of my main things about it was some of the kind of newer breed of films that was coming out around that time about the war and about that experience. I felt like there was still so much melodrama that was brought into it, almost like a Hollywoodization of the story. And because it was such a low budget film, it was just mine. I had the commercial career to survive on. I wasn't concerned if it ever made a dime. I just wanted it to make one that showed it in its most authentic way. Even Brian, the actor who played the main character, he spent some time with a home for kind of like a halfway home for homeless vets that are dealing with like addiction issues and stuff like that. Got to know a lot of them really well. And one of our main focuses on it was there was no score in the movie. His acting was very naturalistic. There's only a few big flare-ups. A lot of the time it was more him trying to suppress those feelings and not show his weaknesses or what he was struggling with. And just like if at any moment this feels like someone's watching a movie, you and I have failed. We would talk about like as an actor and as a director, we failed if this feels like a movie. We wanted it to feel like an experience. And one of the best compliments I've ever gotten, and Brian as well, was after our premiere. There was a gentleman there who was a Marine combat vet, and he told Brian, he's like, every moment of that film I've lived, and a lot of it I still live every day, and I believed you were a Marine up until I saw you do push-ups. And I was like, no, he's an actor. So it was great to see that kind of response. I mean, it was a gamble. It's not an exciting film. It's a very, as a buddy put it, he's like, I didn't enjoy it, but I'm really glad I watched it. It's a film that's a challenge for the audience. It's supposed to be a little upsetting. It's supposed to be slow at times. It's repetitive. It shows his day-to-day cycles of dealing with the same issues over and over again, and how that unravels his almost his willingness to cope with it. And there's no loose ends that are tied up at the end. Characters drop off left and right, because oftentimes when a PTSD attack happens, a lot of the vets I know, they would just flee. They would disappear. They'd go inward, and it would sever ties with people. And so address that in there. So characters don't have arcs in it, because a lot of times in life there isn't a full arc. So it's not a typical story in that way, but I thought it was essential to do it that way because it's the most effective way to express the real struggle of somebody like that.
And I think you said that you had maybe thought of doing a documentary, but you couldn't bring yourself to film them. So then you turned it into a narrative?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That's exactly it. I really, a lot of those vets that I was going around and meeting and getting to, to try and understand it, I would bring a camera with me with the intent of at some point getting them on camera talking about it and showing their life. But, a lot of them were very guarded about this. Again, it's not something that, nobody's proud of being homeless. Nobody's going to talk openly about it. And a lot of them were embarrassed at where they were at, didn't like to admit the struggles they were having. And even just the fact they trusted me to open up to and to let me do that. I mean, sometimes it would take a few meetings for them and to get to really be comfortable with me and understand that I had the best of intentions and was just there to listen, not coming in with an agenda. And so by the time they would finally open up and start talking about, the last thing I wanted to do was throw a camera in their face. I was just like, that just felt to me vulgar to even think about. So I would just sit and listen and, almost be just somebody for them to talk to. And it was amazing how much they were willing to share with me for that. And so I just realized, like, I can do inspiring documentaries where somebody's talking about overcoming adversity. I can talk, do that kind of thing. But getting into that, I actually had the pleasure of meeting Eugene Jarecki one time and asked him how he does it, because some of the interviews he does are, I I had just seen The House I Live In, and he's interviewing a guy who's been sentenced to prison, 20-year-old guy, and asked him afterwards like how he can even do that, and he's like, I can't remember his exact words, but something like, I feel like a monster doing it, but I just keep on thinking about the end goal. It's like, this is more important for other people to see this than for me to feel good about recording it. And I admire him as a documentarian to be able to overcome that sense of guilt in that moment. But for me, it was just easier to take in all of that and then craft it into a narrative based on those real stories and tell it that way. And I also feel like in the end, it was the right choice, beyond just my own creative struggles with being a documentarian. It was the right choice because it reached an audience that a documentary would not have reached. People that were open to watching it in its film form may not have been as open to it in a documentary, which oftentimes documentaries are kind of perceived to already have a political or social agenda. This film wasn't necessarily perceived that way, and overtly it doesn't. It just kind of shows this is what it is, make of it what you will. So that's a part of why the film had that naturalistic tone. And even the short film you'd mentioned was sort of an experiment to see if I could pull it off, because I hadn't done a very naturalistic film before. My shorts and experiments before that were a little bit more in the I would say in the Oliver Stone over the top sort of mold. So it was a new way for me to kind of go into this more natural, realistic approach. And I'm glad I did it that way, because it was a huge learning curve for me, as well as just an incredible experience.
At what point did you realize, though, this is not just going to be a little indie film that'll live on YouTube? I think you said just for a few friends to see. At what point did it cross over to a new audience?
It really, it was, when I started up on it, I definitely had the sense that nobody was going to watch it. This is just, it's not a fun movie to watch. And, even the festival circuit, which was a fascinating thing on its own, we started getting awards, which I was shocked by. But even then, like with the distribution process, signed up with Indie Rights, and Linda and Michael at Indie Rights are just godsends. They're great people. But it was literally the day of our premiere, our theatrical premiere in LA here, and I was on the balcony with Linda, and we'd just gotten the LA Times review, where we had a quarter-page review with our picture from the film, and it was a phenomenal review. And Linda says to me, she's like, "You starting to think maybe you have a good film now?" I'm like, "Everybody else seems to think so I guess so." It was shocking to me, because I guess any creative goes through this. When you look back at your film as you're working on it, you see nothing but flaws and failure and things you wished you'd done differently. And it wasn't until the second night of the screening where we had a guest who came. His name was Sergeant Justin Bond. He was a Army vet from who had been in the fight in Fallujah and lost his leg in it. And he and I were having a great chat before the film, and we sat next to each other through the screening of the film. And it was amazing to experience it that way, because I'm sitting next to this guy who's truly lived the story I made a film about. And there were moments where I got a little chuckle for him every now and then. He'd whisper some little snide remark in my ear, but also you could feel his emotions going through. And so I almost got to experience it fresh through him, being able to kind of see it how he was seeing it for the first time. And that was the first time I ever got to actually experience my own film and enjoy it. I'm very grateful for that experience, for being able to see it through his eyes in a way, in terms of just having his reactions right next to me while he was seeing it and being like, oh, that did work, okay. So yeah, it wasn't really until the second day of our theatrical premiere that I felt like, okay, this film's actually decent and it's gonna go somewhere. And then it was a few weeks later, back in New York, a gentleman who was a Army psychologist in Afghanistan was back giving a talk to a handful of doctors in New York about PTSD, and he invited me to it, and literally told the doctors at this meeting when he ended it, he would reference the film a few times and even had a clip from it that he showed. But he said, if you want to understand what our vets go through when they come back home, watch this gentleman's film, and pointed to me. And so afterwards, talked with a few of the doctors, told them where they could watch it, stuff like that. So it was moments like that where it really was like, okay, this was actually, it's a small indie film, but it was something special. It really just, the people that it was intended to hit, it really hit.
I find that interesting, though, because you said before, I think, in another interview, that anything that could have been said about your film or maybe other films, you've maybe said worse about your own work. And I'm wondering if that almost makes someone better.
I hope all the self-abuse isn't just a waste of time. It is. I mean, I try to always look for the positive in what I'm doing. Obviously, it's what keeps me going. But yeah, the self-criticism, I've gotten some bad reviews in the past, and every single one of them, like, oh yeah, I can see that. That makes sense. The only one that I didn't get, and it was an Amazon comment, was they said they hated the music in Fray. I'm like, there's no score. What are you talking about?
There had to be some troll. Yeah, they had to find. Yeah.
That was the only one I've ever disagreed with.
There was a comment on IMDb about Fray, and I thought it was interesting that you incorporated this part that you mentioned earlier about the self-reliance. And I think the commenter or the reviewer put that the main character in Fray, Justin, rejects anything he interprets as charity.
Yeah.
Did you pick up on that from meeting these vets when you saw them?
Definitely. In fact, there's a line in the short film. This gentleman, this older guy, offers him, he's walking on the street, it's a rainy day, offers him a ride, and after he drops him off at basically at the edge of the forest where the character is sleeping, he offers him, he's like, I got some groceries in the back, and I gave you something like a beer or something. And there's a moment where Justin, the veteran, hesitates, and the guy says to him, it's not charity, it's thanks. And he takes it. And that was kind of the theme of that short film, was the idea of like, these things that we need to do to help our returning combat vets. It's not about charity, it's a thanks. It's for what they've sacrificed. And that was, to a lot of returning vets, again, it's that self-reliance, pride. They don't want charity. They don't see themselves as a charity case. And so, it's not just with vets. I mean, I've seen it even in my own life as an artist. I've had my ups and downs sometimes where, you don't want to ask for help, but you need it. And, what that does to your psyche when you feel like a charity case. And so, really wanted to address that, and kind of brought my own personal experiences with being down and out, having to sleep on somebody's sofa, or not knowing how you're going to eat, and having to ask a friend for $10 or whatever it might be. Try to bring that into it and just show that it's okay to be down and out sometimes. Like, everybody has the potential to fall through the cracks. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't mean that you failed. It just means that as a society, we should help lift each other up. And so I kind of wanted to express that in the film the best I could within that story. There was actually, I'd mentioned earlier when Brian had spent some time with this home with vets, he mentioned that there was a construction site across the street. And at one point, somebody just a big 2x4, something had fallen and clapped against some other wood. And he said it was fascinating for him to observe the reaction of the vets there versus his own. Like, to him, it was like, oh, what was that? To them, it was just like on guard, like just immediate response. Even Vietnam vets, guys have been back for 35, 40 years, 50, terrible with math, however long it's been, older gentlemen who had been back a long time, it was still that loud sound out of nowhere just set them on guard. And so the fireworks are not good for that at all.
No, and there were a lot of them this year.
Yeah.